The laughter began small, almost harmless. Bernie Sanders leaned into the microphone, his shoulders shaking with that familiar rasp in his voice. It was supposed to be lighthearted, a moment of levity in a tense room. He cracked the joke, a jab aimed at Jasmine Crockett, and the audience rewarded him with scattered chuckles. Some leaned back in their seats, grinning. Others clapped, relieved to release the tension with humor. Bernie smiled wide, confident, certain the crowd was on his side. But in that very instant, the atmosphere shifted. Like a camera lens snapping into focus, all eyes turned toward Jasmine. She didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned forward slowly, her posture deliberate, her gaze sharpened. The smile on Bernie's face lingered for a moment too long, frozen in place as if he sensed what was coming but had no way to stop it. The audience laughter softened, then faltered, because everyone could feel it, the silence stretching, the anticipation building. Jasmine's expression wasn't anger. It was colder than that, steadier, sharper, like steel meeting flame. She had been underestimated before, dismissed before, laughed at before. But not this time. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing something seismic about to happen. Phones were already being raised, red lights blinking, screens recording. People knew instinctively that this wasn't just a debate exchange, it was history in the making. Jasmine opened her mouth, and even before a single word escaped, the air in the room seemed to tighten, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Her presence swallowed the chuckles, turned them into silence. For a heartbeat, Bernie still grinned, but his eyes flickered, betraying doubt. And in that frozen second, the story of the night changed. What had started as a joke was no longer funny. What was supposed to be a quick punchline was about to become a turning point, because when Jasmine Crockett finally delivered her line, it wouldn't just silence the laughter. It would silence the entire room. But what happened next? No one was ready for. To understand why that single moment hit with such force, you have to rewind. This wasn't just another debate night. It wasn't simply two politicians crossing swords for headlines. The stage itself carried weight, the kind of weight that only comes when America feels its future tilting in the balance. On one side stood Bernie Sanders, the veteran, the revolutionary elder statesman who had shaped progressive politics for decades. His voice, his hands, his fire, they had defined entire movements. He was the embodiment of endurance, of persistence, of fighting battles that others had abandoned long ago. To many he was untouchable. To others he was outdated, clinging to a legacy rather than forging a new path. And on the other side was Jasmine Crockett, bold, unflinching, unapologetic. She represented a generation not waiting for permission to lead. She carried the rhythms of a new America, the urgency of young voices, the resilience of immigrant stories, the unrelenting demand for dignity. Her presence wasn't just political. It was cultural. It was personal. It was a reminder that the halls of power no longer belonged exclusively to the familiar faces of yesterday. This was more than a clash of personalities. It was a collision of eras. Bernie's wit had been honed in smoky union halls, where jokes could disarm opponents and win allies. But Jasmine stood on a different battlefield, one where identity was not a punchline and where language could cut deeper than policy papers ever could. That's why the joke mattered. It wasn't simply humor. It wasn't merely a harmless jab. It carried with it the weight of 1,000 small dismissals, the kind that women, people of color, and young progressives had felt for generations. It echoed every time someone had laughed at the expense of a voice that demanded to be heard. The audience might have laughed in the moment, but deep down, they knew. This wasn't just banter. This was revelation. The old guard was poking fun, and the new guard was about to prove why that kind of laughter could no longer stand uncontested, and Jasmine Crockett knew it too. She knew she wasn't only answering a joke. She was answering history. She was answering every smirk, every dismissal, every raised eyebrow that told her she didn't belong. That's what gave the room its electricity. That's why phones were recording, why hearts were pounding, why the laughter began to falter. Because the stakes weren't about the punchline, they were about the future. Would the old world continue to laugh at the new, or would the new world finally command silence? And that's why Jasmine Crockett's response would slice deeper than anyone imagined. For decades, Bernie Sanders has been a master of the stage. His voice, hoarse yet commanding, could rise above the din of crowded arenas and congressional hearings alike. He built his reputation not only on the strength of his policies, but also on his ability to connect with ordinary people through humor, sharp one-liners, and quick jabs that left his rivals fumbling. He was not a polished comedian, but his gruff charm carried the cadence of a man who had sparred in countless debates and knew how to turn wit into a weapon. Humor for Bernie was never just about laughter. It was about control. A well-placed joke disarmed opponents, deflected uncomfortable questions, and re-established dominance. He wielded sarcasm like a shield, irony like a sword. When critics accused him of being too radical, he laughed it off, turning their barbs into punchlines. When interviewers tried to corner him, he would respond with a joke that made the audience laugh at the question itself. Over time, this became part of his political arsenal, his signature move, make them laugh, and you win the moment. Crowds loved it. His blunt honesty, punctuated by dry humor, gave him the aura of authenticity. He was the politician who didn't sound like a politician. He was the truth-teller, the outsider, the man who could take a shot at the establishment and get a cheer every time. His supporters believed his wit was proof of his courage. If he could laugh in the face of the powerful, then surely he was fearless. But humor can carry a darker edge. Over the years, Bernie's sharpness sometimes crossed into dismissiveness. Rivals, especially younger ones, often found themselves reduced to the butt of his jokes. He had lived through decades of political wars, and sometimes his barbs came laced with the arrogance of survival. For him, a joke was not cruelty, it was efficiency. Why waste time on a long rebuttal when one line could win the room? On this night, he leaned once more on that trusted weapon. Looking across the stage at Jasmine Crockett, he delivered his line with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. He expected the laugh. He expected the nods of approval. And for a brief second, he got exactly what he wanted. The chuckles rolled. The tension broke. The crowd leaned toward him. But what Bernie didn't see, what he couldn't see, was that the ground beneath him had shifted. The America that once found such dismissiveness charming was no longer the same. His wit, forged in the battles of the past, was clashing with an audience shaped by different battles. Different wounds, different hungers, for a heartbeat. He basked in it, his smile wide, his shoulders loose. He thought he had scored another easy win. The seasoned veteran against the younger challenger, the old master reminding everyone who still held the crown. It was the confidence of a man who had played this game for a lifetime and had never truly paid the price for a punchline. But the flaw in Bernie's humor was always the same. It assumed the person on the receiving end would stay quiet, laugh along, or stumble under the weight of public embarrassment. It assumed control was his to keep. That night, that assumption would collapse, because Jasmine Crockett was not built to be dismissed. She was not going to play the role of the quiet target. The same line of humor that had lifted Bernie for years was about to betray him in a way he never imagined. The crowd didn't know it yet. Bernie didn't know it yet. But history was already tilting, because the same wit that won him crowds before would now cost him everything. Jasmine Crockett's journey was never meant to be easy. From the very beginning, she walked into rooms where the odds were stacked against her. Her story wasn't written in ivory towers or whispered in the safe corridors of inherited privilege. It was carved through grit, carved through doors slammed in her face, carved through every moment she had to prove that her place at the table wasn't a gift, it was earned. She learned early what it meant to be underestimated. In classrooms, her sharpness was mistaken for defiance. In courtrooms, her determination was framed as aggression. And in politics, her unapologetic voice was dismissed as too much, too loud, or too confrontational. Yet with every label thrown her way, Jasmine sharpened her edges. Each attempt to minimize her only made her bolder, more certain that silence was never an option. When she entered public life, she carried with her the fire of a fighter. Not the polished, carefully crafted image of a politician raised to speak in measured tones, but the raw, unfiltered authenticity of someone who knew that survival demanded strength. She represented the unrepresented, the people whose voices too often echoed unheard in the chambers of power. And she did it with a presence that could not be ignored. Jasmine Crockett didn't rise because she was invited. She rose because she refused to stay down. Every setback became fuel. Every insult became energy. Every dismissal became a reminder that she had been counted out before. And yet here she stood. Her very existence on that stage was a triumph, Proof that resilience could not only break barriers but redefine them. And it wasn't just her story that made her formidable. It was her style. Jasmine didn't wrap her words in delicate packaging. She didn't soften her truth to make it easier to swallow. She spoke with the rhythm of lived experience, with a cadence that carried the weight of struggle and the promise of tomorrow. When she raised her voice, it wasn't just hers. It was a chorus of those who had been silenced, laughed at, or overlooked. In that debate, she brought all of it with her. The scars, the fire, the unshakable calm in the storm. She sat across from Bernie Sanders not as someone desperate for approval, but as someone who had already fought battles tougher than any stage could offer. His joke might have landed for a second, but she knew how to turn moments like that into power. She had done it before, in the courtroom, in interviews, in countless conversations where her opponents thought they could shrink her down with a smirk. And every time, she rose taller. What made her dangerous to those who underestimated her wasn't just her resilience. It was the way she thrived under pressure. Where others stumbled in silence, Jasmine found her sharpest words. Where others backed down, she leaned in. Every dismissive tone, every raised eyebrow, every laugh at her expense became her cue to strike back harder, clearer, stronger. That's why, when Bernie cracked his joke, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't laugh along, didn't play into the dismissal. She did what she always did. She absorbed it, transformed it, and prepared to send it back with a force multiplied tenfold. She wasn't only responding for herself. She was responding for the young women who were told their ambition was arrogance, for the children of immigrants who were told their identities were burdens, for the countless voices that had been drowned out by the loudness of old power. And in that moment, as the laughter in the room began to fade, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward with the calm of someone who had waited her entire life for opportunities just like this one. She was not intimidated. She was not shaken. She was ready, because Jasmine Crockett's gift, her secret weapon, was not just her ability to survive insults, it was her ability to turn them into thunder. And this time, her words would land like a thunderclap. The joke hung in the air like smoke, curling around the room, slow to fade. Bernie Sanders delivered it with that gravelly voice, his trademark grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. For a beat, the audience followed his lead. A ripple of laughter rolled across the crowd, uneven but audible. A few claps punctuated it as if to say, "Yes, that's Bernie, always quick with a jab." Bernie's shoulders relaxed. He leaned back just slightly satisfied. This was familiar terrain, the territory of humor as dominance, humor as dismissal. He had seen it work before. The chuckles reinforced his confidence, as though he had already won this round. But then came the pause. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't offer the polite chuckle that some might have expected. She didn't glance away, didn't shuffle her notes, didn't break eye contact. She simply sat, still as stone, her gaze fixed squarely on Bernie. The crowd's laughter began to wither. What started as amusement turned into confusion, then into anticipation. People leaned forward in their seats. The tension wasn't loud, it was quiet, suffocating. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, that made every breath feel heavier. Bernie's grin lingered, but the edges started to falter. His eyes darted for a fraction of a second, as though searching the audience for confirmation that the laugh was still alive. But already the room was shifting. Already the atmosphere was no longer his. Jasmine let the moment stretch. 1 second, 2 seconds. Long enough for the silence to grow teeth. Long enough for the audience to realize they were no longer watching Bernie control the stage. They were watching him lose it. Every detail seemed magnified. The faint hum of the microphone. The nervous cough from somewhere in the back row. The clicking of a camera shutter. The smallest sounds became thunder against the backdrop of silence. And Jasmine, still unmoving, leaned forward just slightly. Just enough to make it clear. She was about to speak. The crowd's breath hitched. They knew something was coming, but they didn't know what. Was it anger? Was it retreat? Would she stumble, falter, laugh it off? The suspense was unbearable. In that instant, it felt cinematic. The music, if there had been any, would have dropped into a low, steady rumble. The camera, if there had been one, would have closed in on her eyes, unblinking, unshaken. The stage lights seemed harsher now, the contrast sharper. Bernie's fading grin against Jasmine's steady composure. This wasn't just another exchange. This was a standoff, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't flinching. The silence grew louder than any laugh could have been. The audience shifted in their seats, waiting, hanging, knowing that whatever came next would decide the moment. Then, with a single line, the energy in the room shifted. Her voice sliced through the silence, steady and cold. "Senator, you can laugh all you want, but the truth doesn't bend for your punchlines." The words landed with a weight that could not be ignored. It wasn't the volume that shook the room, it was the precision. Like a blade sliding between armor, her line struck at the heart of the moment, clean and undeniable. The laughter that had filled the room seconds earlier evaporated instantly, replaced by a hush so deep it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Bernie's grin faltered. For the first time that night, his expression betrayed him. The smirk that had always been his shield slipped, revealing the flicker of doubt beneath. His hands, which just moments before had gestured confidently, now rested awkwardly on the podium. Jasmine didn't stop there. Her gaze was unflinching, her tone calm, almost surgical. "You've spent your life calling out the powerful for ignoring the people. But when it's someone like me standing across from you, someone younger, someone unapologetic, you think you can wave it away with a joke." "That's not truth, Senator. That's condescension." Gasps rippled through the audience. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they should applaud or remain still. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, caught in the gravity of what was unfolding. The cameras caught it all. The slow zoom on Bernie's fading expression, the sharp cut to Jasmine's steady glare, the panning shots across a crowd frozen between admiration and shock. The debate had transformed into a spectacle, but not one Bernie controlled anymore. And Jasmine was only getting started. "You see," she continued, her voice unwavering, "what you call a joke feels very different to the people who live at the sharp end of being dismissed. To the women who've been told they're too emotional, to the young people who've been told they're too naive, to the communities who've been told they don't belong here. Laughter is easy when it's not your dignity on the line." It was a masterstroke. She wasn't just responding to Bernie. She was speaking to the millions watching at home, to the people scrolling through clips on their phones, to the communities who had been waiting for someone to say exactly this. She had widened the moment from a personal exchange to a universal truth. The crowd, caught between awe and hesitation, began to shift again. A murmur of approval rose from one corner, a soft clap from another, and then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar. Some in the audience stood, unable to contain themselves. Others still sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Bernie tried to interject, his voice rising, but it was too late. The timing was gone. The momentum was no longer his. He was standing in the shadow of her words, struggling against a silence that no joke could break. And Jasmine, sensing the moment, delivered the final blow. "You don't get to laugh off accountability, not anymore. Not when people's lives are on the line. Not when our future is hanging in the balance. You can dismiss me, Senator, but you can't dismiss the people I represent." "We're not the punchline, we're the story." The room exploded. Applause, cheers, a wave of energy that rattled the stage. Phones shot higher into the air, capturing every second. Clips were already being uploaded, captions being typed. Crockett shuts down Sanders with one icy line. Bernie lowered his gaze, his hands gripping the podium as though steadying himself against the force of the moment. For years, his wit had been enough. But tonight, in this clash, it wasn't. The contrast was stark. On one side, the elder statesman, his armor of humor cracked, his confidence shaken. On the other, the rising voice of a new generation, steady, composed, triumphant. It was the passing of a torch without ceremony, the kind of moment that feels small in the instant, but grows larger with every retelling, and the audience knew it. You could see it in their faces, eyes wide, jaws slack, some smiling, others still stunned. They had witnessed something unforgettable, a turning point that couldn't be unwound. As the applause thundered, the cameras panned across the crowd, catching expressions that told the whole story: disbelief, admiration, pride, even fear. And somewhere in the shadows of the room, the first tweets and posts began to go viral. Bernie jokes, Crockett ends him. That line. That stare, iconic. Ice-cold response from Jasmine Crockett. The moment was already leaving the confines of the debate hall, spreading into living rooms, onto timelines, into history. Bernie adjusted his glasses, his lips pressed into a thin line. He tried to recover, to move on, but the ground beneath him had shifted permanently. Jasmine had seized control, and the debate from that point forward belonged to her. The mic drop was complete, and the echo of her words, steady, sharp, undeniable, would reverberate far beyond that stage. Because sometimes history doesn't turn on policies or polls. Sometimes it turns on a single line, delivered at the perfect moment, with the weight of truth behind it, and Jasmine Crockett had just delivered hers. The debate ended, but the real battle had only just begun. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's icy counterpunch, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube lit up like a fireworks show. Clips of the exchange, some edited with dramatic music, others slowed down to highlight Bernie's fading smile, spread faster than the moderators could even clear their notes from the stage. Hashtags ignited instantly. Crockett clapped back, ice-cold line, Bernie owned. Each one climbed the trending charts in real time, fighting for dominance on the digital battlefield. By the time midnight hit on the East Coast, the moment had gone global. Influencers posted reaction videos, some laughing, some wide-eyed, all repeating the same line. She ended him. TikTok was flooded with edits, zoom-ins on Jasmine's stare, captions flashing the words, "We're not the punchline, we're the story." Memes bloomed like wildfire. Bernie's fading grin paired with captions like, "When the joke backfires." Others set the clip to cinematic music, turning Jasmine's stare into a movie trailer moment. Journalists and commentators weighed in next. Cable news panels replayed the line on loop, each host adding their take. One declared it a generational torch passing in real time. Another dismissed it as theatrics with no substance. Yet another called it the most devastating live debate takedown in years. The split-screen effect became undeniable. On one side, supporters flooded timelines with admiration. This wasn't just a clapback. It was a cultural reset. Jasmine Crockett just gave voice to everyone who's ever been dismissed with a smirk. I've never seen Bernie look so small. On the other side, defenders of Bernie scrambled to contain the damage. It was just a joke. People are too sensitive. Bernie's earned the right to joke. This is cancel culture at work. Jasmine's response was rehearsed theater. Nothing more. The clash wasn't just about two politicians anymore. It had become a mirror of America's deeper divides. Generational, racial, gendered, ideological. Every replay of the moment carried more weight than the original exchange. Because people weren't just watching the debate, they were watching themselves in it. Talk shows devoted entire segments. Podcasters dissected Jasmine's tone, her cadence, the exact moment Bernie's grin broke. Late-night comedians joked that Bernie brought a punchline, Jasmine brought the knockout. And still, the moment grew. By morning, millions of views had turned into tens of millions. Opinion writers framed it as the moment Crockett went national. Others questioned whether Bernie's era of unshakable dominance was over. But the true shockwave wasn't measured in clicks or views. It was cultural. In classrooms, young people repeated Jasmine's line, sharing it like a mantra. In community centers, older activists debated whether Bernie's stumble signaled something bigger. In living rooms, families sat divided, not about who was right, but about what the moment meant. And that was the real story. The debate had ended on stage, but its aftershocks were rewriting conversations across America. A generational clash had been distilled into a single exchange, and Jasmine Crockett's words were no longer just hers. They belonged to everyone who felt dismissed, minimized, or silenced. The culture had shifted, and neither Bernie Sanders nor Jasmine Crockett would ever stand in the same light again. But the true impact wasn't just digital, it was cultural. And culture, once shifted, doesn't snap back. It reshapes everything. In the end, the moment between Bernie Sanders and Jasmine Crockett was never really about a joke. It wasn't about a single line, or even about two politicians standing under stage lights. It was about something far greater, what happens when dignity meets dismissal, and truth refuses to bow to arrogance. Bernie had leaned on humor, a weapon that once made him untouchable. But in that instant, laughter became hollow. Jasmine transformed the stage into a proving ground, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been brushed aside with a smirk. She didn't shout. She didn't sputter. She looked the joke in the eye and answered it with the kind of composure that history remembers. And that's why her response struck so deeply. It wasn't only a rebuttal, it was a reminder that power doesn't always wear the loudest voice or the longest resume. Sometimes power is the courage to stand unshaken when the world expects you to stumble. Sometimes power is silence that cuts sharper than noise, truth that steadies the ground beneath us. In that single line, Jasmine became more than a participant in a debate. She became a symbol, a vessel of resilience, a beacon for those who know that respect is earned not by clever punchlines, but by unwavering presence. Her words told America that being underestimated can be fuel, that the underdog's fire can outshine the polished routine of the seasoned veteran. The moral was clear, simple and unforgettable. Laughter fades, but respect endures. Audiences felt it in their bones. They saw themselves in her. Immigrants, women, young people, workers, anyone who had ever felt minimized. The ice in her tone was not cruelty, but clarity, a refusal to let dignity be reduced to the setup of a joke. She didn't just defend herself. She defended everyone watching who has ever felt unseen, and perhaps that is why the moment will echo longer than the applause, longer than the hashtags, longer than the fleeting news cycle. Because the lesson was not about Bernie Sanders losing his footing. It was about Jasmine Crockett showing what it means to rise. When the lights dim and the stage clears, what remains is not who laughed the hardest, but who stood the tallest. And on that night, in that room, it was Jasmine. Her words left more than silence. They left an imprint, a truth that audiences carried with them long after the cameras shut off. That dignity will always outlast dismissal, and respect, once earned, can never be taken away. And so, as the crowd filed out and the world replayed her line again and again, one truth lingered. This was no longer just about a debate. It was about who we are and who we choose to be. Bernie Sanders cracked the joke. The crowd laughed. For a heartbeat, it seemed like another moment where wit would win the night. But then, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her eyes sharp, her words colder than ice, and in an instant the entire room froze. That was the moment we'll remember. Not the punchline, not the smirk, but the silence that followed, heavy with truth. This clash wasn't just about two politicians trading barbs. It was about what we choose to value, clever dismissals or enduring respect. Bernie's laughter faded almost as quickly as it rang out. Jasmine's dignity, her fire, her refusal to be belittled, that will endure long after the hashtags stop trending. Because here's the lesson we can all carry. Words have power. They can tear down or they can lift up. They can dismiss or they can defend. And when spoken with courage, they can reshape the room, the conversation, even the culture itself. Jasmine Crockett showed us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from shouting louder, but from standing firmer. So take that energy with you, into your work, your friendships, your struggles. Remember that laughter fades, but respect endures. And when the moment comes for you to speak your truth, speak it without hesitation. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Jasmine's fire, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who needs the reminder, and join this movement of truth, dignity, and courage. Because voices like Jasmine's, and like yours, are what keep the light burning against arrogance and dismissal. Together, we don't just watch history, we shape it.